Well, today we are finishing our series on a new kind of community, and today we're going to be focusing in on a passage of scripture found in Luke chapter 24, verses 13 through 34. And I'm going to invite you to stand as you hear this word, and I read it together. The same day, 2 of Jesus' followers were walking to the village of Emmaus, 7 miles from Jerusalem. As they walked along, they were talking about everything that had happened. And they talked and discussed these things. Jesus himself suddenly came and began walking with them. But God kept them from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing so intently as you walk along?" They stopped short, sadness written across their faces, and one of them, Cleopas, replied, You must be the only person in Jerusalem who hasn't heard about all the things that have happened here in the last few days. "What things?" Jesus asked. "The things that have happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles. He was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who had come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago, and then some women from our group of his followers were at his tomb early this morning, and they came back with an amazing report. They said his body was missing, and they had seen angels and told them that Jesus was alive. Some of our men ran out to see, and sure enough, his body was gone, just as the women had said. Then Jesus said to them, 'You foolish people. You find it so hard to believe all that the prophets wrote in scriptures? Wasn't it clearly predicted that the Messiah would have to suffer all these things before entering his glory?' Then Jesus took them through the writings of Moses and all the prophets, explaining from all the scriptures and the things concerning himself. By the time they were nearing Emmaus and the end of their journey, Jesus acted as if he was going on, but they begged him, 'Stay the night with us, since it's getting late.' So he went home with them, and they sat down to eat. He took the bread and blessed it. Then he broke it and gave it to them, and suddenly their eyes were opened and they recognized him. And at that moment, he disappeared. They said to each other, 'Didn't our hearts burn within us as he talked with us on the road and exclaimed the scriptures to us?' And within the hour, they were on their way back to Jerusalem. Then they found the 11 disciples and the others who had gathered with them and said, 'The Lord has really risen. He has appeared to Peter.' This is the word of our Lord and Savior. Praise be to God. You may be seated. Well, I apologize. I hope I am not going to have to stop too much. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold for a few days, so bear with me as my voice may be a little rough as well today as we go. Well, the road to Emmaus is one of my favorite stories, and it's one we typically hear at Easter time. And one of the things I appreciate about this story is that so much happens in a quick 24-hour period. And one of the things I think we see in this story is this story shows us the power and the impact of what a transformational community is. And as we are finishing our series called A New Kind of Community, that really is our focus, isn't it? We are creating communities where transformation is anticipated and expected in each and every one of its members. So as I use the word transformational community, because I'll be saying that a lot today, what do I mean by that? So let's break down that a little bit. Well, transformation, we're going to start with spiritual transformation. Spiritual transformation is the process in which Jesus has been formed in and through us for the glory of God. So by the abundance of our lives, so how we live out our lives, we can begin to share the love of Jesus to the world around us, not only for our sake, but for the sake of others. Spiritual transformation allows us to discern God's will and begin to live out God's will naturally and effortlessly as we seek to follow his ways. Spiritual transformation reveals to the world that there is hope, that there is grace, that there is forgiveness, and above all, that there is love. as we become that living witness, that living testimony for how Jesus has changed us. And in general, this transformation happens in different ways. It happens in degrees. We see that referenced in 2 Corinthians 3:18, which means that as we are moving along in our faith, we continually are being refined and transformed more into the image of God. It won't happen overnight, and it'll happen until the day that we die. But transformation isn't just about degrees. Transformation also happens when we are with others, which is why community is so essential. Because we need others to grow, as we see in 1 Corinthians 12. That how our spiritual transformation happens is not on our own journey, but it's as we are in community with one another. So therefore, as we look at what it means to be a spiritual transformational community, we know that this is central to the message of the gospel and central to the mission of the church. This is how we live into the Great Commission to go and make disciples, while also embodying the great commandment that we are to love God and love others. And today, as we focus on some of these key healthy transformational markers, I want you to hear it from a few different directions. Typically, we preach and we tell you the passage and everything, and at the end we say, how do you respond? And we have you respond at the end. But today I'm going to flip it, and instead of doing the response at the end, we're going to start with it. Because I want you to start looking for this and reflecting on it right now, these healthy transformational markers. So there's two different ways that you can hear this today. First, if you are already in a growth group, as you are discovering this and listening today about these healthy transformational markers, I want you to hear it and celebrate how God is at work. As you're hearing about some of these healthy markers, reflect on how you have already seen them in their groups. Because sometimes we come to these kind of messages and we think, oh, we're not doing enough, we're not doing good. And today I want to affirm, if you are in a group, you're most likely growing. You're growing by those degrees and you're growing in community. So as you're hearing it today, find encouragement. And maybe there are some areas where God is calling your group to grow, and take some time as you go back to your group to process that together. What does this look like to add some of these markers into our lives? Now, for others of you, you're maybe not involved in a growth group, and you know we are in this series right now where we're talking and encouraging people to join into community. And so as you're hearing about these healthy markers, I want to encourage you to say that these healthy markers are what we create for each of our communities, for each of our growth groups. It's a place where you can feel safe, where you can experience community, where you are loved, just where you are. And so maybe as you're hearing this message today, it's a reminder and a call to say, you know what, I need that in my life. I need to be in a place where then I can experience that spiritual transformation and walk with others in a safe place to do it as well. So as we look at this, we're going to look at the story of Emmaus as we move through it. Because in Emmaus, we actually see the beginnings of transformational communities. And it happens in the most unexpected places with two disciples, Cleopas and an unnamed disciple. And they're traveling back home from Jerusalem on the third day, on Easter Day. See, Emmaus was about 7 miles away from Jerusalem, and we don't exactly know the whole story of these two disciples. But we know that they were in town for the Passover, that they were followers of Jesus, and they expected big and great things to happen over that weekend. But what they saw and witnessed was Jesus' crucifixion, his death, and his burial. And this was not the outcome that they had expected or they had anticipated. Their emotions are probably all over the place at this point. They're upset, they're saddened, they're confused, but they're also realistic. They're also focused on just being pragmatic. And so they know they can't stay in Jerusalem. They have to go home. They have to return to where they are, and they need to start making sense of everything. They need to restart their lives and go back to what is predictable and safe and expected. And as they're leaving, they're processing all that's happening. And the word that's actually used here for their conversation is called skitsin. And skitsin actually isn't a conversation. It actually means a strongly worded debate. And debate is an interesting term, isn't it? You know, I have a debater in my house. We have lots of debates at our family table at times. And debating is fun, but debating rarely includes listening. Debating implies a sense of arguing at each other, trying to win an argument and talking at each other, trying to prove points to one another. So rather than listening to one another, they're debating each other, and this was not a place of conversation, of comfort, or of solace. And that's when the stranger arrives and walks in with them. And we're clued in that it's Jesus, but they are kept from recognizing him. And in this moment, this is what I see. I see the beginnings of a transformational community being formed. Because in this moment, the story shifts. Because when Jesus arrives, it moves from a debate with each other to a conversation with Jesus. And what brings that shift? Ultimately, it's Jesus. He is the key that makes transformational communities happen. He is the reason that we can come together and be different than any other social club or any other affinity club or any other group that you are participating in. Jesus changes the narrative and it changes the outcomes. And we're reminded in Matthew 18:20 that when two or three are gathered together as my followers, I am among them. See, what we see is you don't have to be in large groups. You don't have to be in a big, significant group for Jesus to be present or for transformation to happen. Jesus can happen in 2 or 3 in the little. And Jesus promises to be there. And when Jesus is present, transformation then begins to have the opportunity to cultivate and to develop. And what I love about that and what we're starting to see on this road, on this journey of Emmaus, is that they, and also we, when we begin to journey, when we're journeying with other people, we may not always recognize or know that Jesus is present. We may not know that he's walking or journeying or guiding or helping us along the way. And yet, because Jesus is there, and because we are in community with others, as we walk together, as we commune together, as we commit together, we have opportunities to learn, to grow, and experience his transformation in our lives. So as we're inviting and traveling others to be with us, we can lean into the assurance that even when we are unable to acknowledge his presence in our lives or in the lives that we're walking with, that he is there. And it reminds me of Jesus' words as he describes the kingdom of God like yeast that a woman makes in her bread. Even though she puts in only a little bit of yeast, in 3 measures of flour, it permeates into every part of the dough. You see, when we are together, even in small groups, even when we are unable to see how God is moving, even when we can't even recognize and articulate that he is there, God's kingdom is moving and his spirit is permeating through the entire experience. He is bringing us to a place where we can experience complete healing and transformation, and he provides those opportunities for transformation to occur. And for these 2 disciples, they needed transformation because they were in a place of arguing, of debating, of uncertainty, filled with questions and fears and doubts. And that's where Jesus meets them. And what does Jesus do? Well, he begins by asking questions, right? What are you 2 discussing? I think this is significant. See, by asking questions, Jesus actually moves these 2 disciples from a place where they quit debating and talking at each other to a place where they can begin to share their thoughts, to a place where they can share their emotions, to a place where they actually have to start acknowledging the losses that they are experiencing in their own lives. And this is the first healthy marker we see in transformational communities. Transformational communities are places where it is safe to ask questions. And I know this is hard for us at times because we often begin with our own knowledge. We begin with our own understandings and we assume certain things. And if we don't know something, we go and we seek to learn all about it. Man, we love Google, don't we? We can find out anything and everything on it. We are people who've been raised in the Enlightenment. And typically, as we get together in small communities, what we have done is we've made our focus on studying and teaching and learning and gaining as much information as possible. It's in essence, the more you know. Do you remember, I don't know if our slides are working right now. I had a slide up of this campaign. Do you remember this campaign from NBC about 20 or 30 years ago? It was a very successful advertising campaign. They would come in and teach you something, and at the end they'd go, well, the more you know. And they'd imply the more you know, the better you're off, the better you could be a person. And it reinforces that transformation happens by the more you know. The more that you know, the more equipped you can be in the world. And yet transforming communities don't really happen through this more you know ideal. Transforming communities aren't about just having cognitive knowledge. Think back to the way that the Jewish rabbis taught. Think how Jesus taught. They did not spend most of their time teaching and talking. What did they do? They spent most of their time asking questions and allowing people to process. Because as we ask questions, we're giving people an opportunity to share where they are. We're giving them opportunities to actually start working out their own faith and acknowledging what they own need in their lives. You know, as Jesus walked, he asked a lot of different questions, but we see different types of questions happening in his ministry. As he was healing people physically and emotionally, one of the main questions he often asked is, what do you want me to do for you? And as he would ask people this, what would you want me to do for you? They had to get to a place where they had to acknowledge and share and say, I want this, I need this in my life. He also did it on the spiritual level as he talked to people and he said, who do you say I am? And again, his disciples had to work that out and own who they were and get to the point where they said, you are the Messiah. I trust and believe in you and you alone. By asking questions, we allow people the opportunity to journey, to wrestle, to share where they are in this process together. And that's needed for transformation to happen. So these two disciples, they needed somebody to actually listen to them, not argue or debate them, not to teach them about present cultural understandings, but just to ask them questions and for them to listen. And Jesus gives them that gift, the gift of his time and the gift to listen without interruption or correction. And so as these disciples, they continue to walk and they talk, they begin to share where they are. They share their stories of hurt, of confusion and sadness and pain, and they recap their perspective of who they believe Jesus was and what they had anticipated Jesus to do. And the most telling moment is when they share, we had hoped he was the one who is going to redeem Israel. See, in that one sentence, you begin to sense the hopelessness of these disciples. You see their inability to grasp that God is working in a bigger picture, in a bigger way, and you see the utter despair that they are experiencing. All that they had dreamed or lived for or followed and hoped for had ended 3 days ago. And can you imagine what it would be like for Jesus to hear this? Can you imagine what it would have been like for him to listen to them in these moments and to hear this despair and this sadness and seeing them walk away from Jerusalem? Can you imagine how hard it would have been for him to remain silent and not actually begin talking to them, not begin teaching them or telling them the truth or lecturing them and on their willingness to escape this reality and move back to another reality? And you maybe wonder, well, why would Jesus do that? Why would Jesus allow them to rest in this moment of pain and suffering? Why wouldn't Jesus bring forward a conclusion of joy and answer it all right then and there? Why does he listen to their wrong theology and their wrong perspectives without entering in to change or correct them? I believe what Jesus is doing is modeling the second marker of a healthy transformational community. You see, transformational communities are empathetic. See, remember, empathy isn't about trying to solve any situation. It's not trying to fix it. Empathy isn't trying to justify or even teach in those moments. Empathy isn't putting a silver lining around the situation and trying to make them feel better about their situation. Empathy isn't about sharing your own story and saying, oh, I've experienced something similar. Let me tell you about my story so that you can maybe feel better. Empathy is simply about listening to understand. Empathy is putting yourself in the situation to really get to the place where you know who they are and really know what they are carrying, what those burdens are. Listening to not only the good things, but the hard things and the difficult things, and even the things that may be askew or off balance a little bit. But instead of responding and instead of coming in and immediately being optimistic or spiritualizing it and saying things like, well, God has a plan for you, which is true. But instead of moving there, empathy just rests in the listening, in the pain, in whatever perspective is shared in those moments. And let me tell you, friends, it's through empathy that relationships are really built. This is how trust is formed. And trust, as we know, is so essential. As we know, as we look at community right now, not our church, but as society and communities as a whole, trust is something that is lacking. People all over the place do not trust each other in the way that God has called us to trust. We don't trust each other because we know we have different views politically or theologically or culturally, and we always have barriers up because we're afraid of what somebody will think or say or how we will get hurt in the process. And I wonder if one of the reasons that we have lost trust is because we've lost the ability to really listen to people. That we've lost the ability to empathize first with one another. And see, this is the way that Jesus modeled community. He asked questions first, and he listened next. And then, and only then, after periods or seasons of developing this type of community, after trust is established, after there is questions and listening and empathy, only then can we begin to speak. And as Jesus begins to speak in the story, we see that he doesn't begin with an "I told you so." He's not coming in and saying, oh, well, let me tell you how I was right and how I did everything. He doesn't begin with teaching in the present context. He's not saying, all right, let me tell you about what you see right now and how I can teach out of it, what your senses are, see, hear, experience, and all of that. He doesn't begin in the present. How Jesus teaches. Jesus speaks by going backward. He goes backward and teaches from a posture of remembering. And that's the next key healthy marker for transformational communities. Because transformational communities are those that focus on remembering God's story. And as Jesus speaks, he's explaining the scriptures. He's going back to the beginning, to Moses and the prophets and all of that. And he's reminding these two disciples of two truths, of God's faithfulness and of God's promises. He's focusing less on teaching them and more on helping them remember who God is and helping them remember their place in God's story. You see, remembering is so important for transformational communities because remembering helps us in our shared stories to give identity to who we are and shapes us for how we live our lives. Remembering points us back to the words found in Psalm 105, verses 5-8. Remember the wonders that he has performed, his miracles and the rulings he has given your children of his servant Abraham, your descendants of Jacob, his chosen ones. He is the Lord our God. His justice is seen throughout the land. He always stands by his covenant and the commitment he made to 1,000 generations. Remember who God is. Remember what he has done for us, not just you now, but remember for your family, for your generations, for your nation, for your community. Remember how God has worked in and through all of that. And as you remember who God is. Allow yourself to move and flow out of that confidence, out of that trust. And as human beings, we forget that often. When things are difficult or we don't understand things, we choose to forget very quickly. And so God continually says, remember who I am and where I've come from and the promises that I have given you. Which is why one of the primary ways we are called to be in community together is to encourage, to support, and exhort one another. Remember in Hebrews 10:24, let us not neglect meeting together to encourage and inspire each other to good works. Let us get together so that we can help each other remember who God is and our place in God's story. This is what we are taught, and by remembering, we are able to move forward with a courage to go in ways that feel difficult or scary at times. Remembering is what we do when we remember that we are part of the gospel, the good news. And when we remember that we are part of this story, it encourages us to go out and share that good news with others in the same way. And of course, there are times in our lives where we do need to teach, especially with new Christians. They have to be taught new truths that they may not be aware of. But the reality is for most of our time, we need to remember the old story of Jesus and his deep, unconditional love. So as Jesus is gently teaching and opening the scriptures to them, their hearts begin to warm, and they sense God's presence, but they aren't yet fully able to understand it. And the whole Emmaus narrative is kind of this revelatory process for the disciples so that they can begin to connect the dots and see why the death and the resurrection befits the Messiah, how that all came together. But it didn't come together by Jesus teaching them from a present context. It came from remembering it. And in that environment where they're being asked questions, where they're being listened to with empathy, where they're remembering the truths of who God's as, what you can see is transformation begins to happen. Because these disciples, they want more. When they reach Emmaus, they don't want him to leave. They urge him and they say, come into our house, come and have dinner with us. They want to be with him even longer. And as they prepare a meal to eat together, you see, through this dinner, transformation begins to happen. As Jesus takes this bread, he breaks it and the disciples' eyes are opened. And I love the fact that it was bread, because bread was a commonplace item in this time. Meat was a luxury. You didn't have meat very often. Fruits and vegetables, it depended on the harvest when you would get things like this, but every day there would be bread. Every day, there was an opportunity to remember who Jesus was. And when Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper, he not only is he taking Passover liturgy and reinterpreting it through who he is, but he's also using elements that were so commonplace that each and every home, each and every family would have each and every day to remember who he is. And it's as if he's showing us that it's not enough just to remember, but there's this symbiotic relationship between remembering and engaging and experiencing together. Because that's the next thing that we see as a healthy marker in transformational communities. See, transformational communities not only remember, but they participate together. And you can't experience transformation if you're sitting back, if you're a bystander, if you're not willing to get engaged and connected in the process. And so as each of these disciples, as they take this meal, as they eat together, as they drink together, they begin to remember Jesus' death. They remember Jesus' resurrection, and they see it personally, and they experience that forgiveness that Jesus has already promised them, and they celebrate it, and that Jesus will come again, and Jesus disappears in that moment. The disciples actively know who Jesus is now. It wasn't just cognitive knowledge. It wasn't just remembering and having these teachable moments. What it was this knowledge and knowing that reached their body, soul, and spirit. They experienced transformation because they were participating together. And then no longer did the disciples then want to escape. No longer do they want to just go back to the way that they'd done things before. They want to go back to Jerusalem. They know they have to get back. So they get up within the next hour, and it must be pretty late in the evening because they have just had dinner and they'd asked Jesus to stay for the night. But yet it didn't matter. Being realistic or pragmatic or practical wasn't on their plan. They had experienced transforming community, being together with Jesus, and they needed to share it with others. And so they ran that 7.5 miles back to Jerusalem in the night. See, that's the natural consequence of transforming communities. See, as we are transformed, as we are continually being transformed, we naturally want to share it with others too. This is the contagious faith that we have seen all throughout scriptures as Jesus transforms. Just look at the shepherds in the field as they experienced, as they came and saw and knelt before the baby Messiah, as they saw him and saw God's promises. What did? They run back into Bethlehem. Shepherds were outcast. It didn't matter that they were outcasted. They went to each and every person to tell them about what they had seen and experienced. Think about the woman at the well. She was shamed. She was somebody who was an outcast. And yet when Jesus meets her where she is, when Jesus says, I am the living water, and he gives her new life and new hope, what does she do? She's not afraid of people anymore. She runs back into that community and begins to tell and share and tell everybody what Jesus has done. Think about all the blind and sick and lame that Jesus healed. As Jesus healed them and transformed them in their lives, oftentimes Jesus said, I need you not to say anything yet because it's not my time. And yet they can't. They can't hold it silent. They go back and they immediately begin to tell people what Jesus had done for them in those moments. You see, transformation brings a contagious spirit to share the love of Jesus with others. And that is why this story is a precursor to our Acts study that we are beginning next week. See, in many ways, this story is the beginning, showing the beginnings of the small church, of these house communities, of the church growing and the movement of churches and the revelation of faith that's going to be happening. Because as we see in the story, transformational communities happen, and it begins to grow, and it begins to change. And this journey that we're going to be taking as a whole church community is going to be significant for us. It's going to be a place where we actually see all of the things that we've been talking about throughout the entire summer as a church community. You know, we've been in an overarching series called Church in Action since way back, I think in March or April. And we focused first on the fact that as a church in action is one that makes and deepens disciples, that we are called to fish for people. And then we were talking about the fact that we are called to unity, not only with people outside in the world, but together as a community as well. And then we talked about that a church in action is one that is called and gifted and uses our gifts to serve and bless. And then we focus this time on a new community, that we are communities that are grouped together, that are sharing life in all different ways. And what we are going to see as we move into the series of Acts is that each and every single ways that church becomes action is solidified and grounded in the particular place of the book of Acts. We're going to see it all come together. And if you've not picked up your books yet, this book yet, I invite you to do so at the Welcome Center. And if you haven't joined a growth group so that you can actually be a part of this series with other people, I invite you to find out more so that we can put you in a place where you can actually journey with us on this Acts journey together. Because as we move into the fall, we are a church that deeply seeks transformation. It is in our vision. We are a church that is becoming like Jesus together. So may we come to a place where we open ourselves up to see how the Holy Spirit is moving and working. Where we enter into community groups, where we ask questions, where we empathize, where we remember God's story, and we participate together, and we allow God's presence to transform our lives each and every day.